Okay, so a while back I posted a response video to my own blog review of Revenge of the Sith from way back in 2013. Unfortunately, it got blocked by Disney. I'm trying to work that out as of recording this video. But anyway, I wanted at the time to also look at my Phantom Menace review, but it got really long, so I decided to do it separately. So here's my response video for my Phantom Menace review. So let's look at this. All right, Star Wars: The Phantom Menace review. Okay, this was posted in November of 2015. At the time, we were rewatching all the old Star Wars movies in the lead up to Episode 7 coming out. I was really excited at the time, of course, and I still didn't like the prequels. Hopefully, at least my writing skills have improved, but I'm sure I'll find a lot to disagree with here. So let's get started. All right, Star Wars: The Phantom Menace review. Well, I'm back, again. With the imminent release of Episode 7, I've been rewatching the first 6 Star Wars films. Since my first review, though not my first post on this blog, was for Revenge of the Sith, I thought this would be a good time to go back and review the first prequel. I would like to try and post more regularly for the time being, at least a few more times a month, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, whatever. Alright. The Phantom Menace is a film I feel somewhat reluctant to review, as so many others have picked it apart that I'm not sure if I have anything new to add. A lot of people begin their prequel reviews with these sort of disclaimers. There was a sort of a feeling after the Plinkett reviews that, those were the definitive ones. I, of course, do not agree with that at all anymore. This is a pretty cringy way to start this, but what should I expect, I guess, at this point? I don't know. All right, continuing on. However, there are certain things that stuck out to me in my most recent viewing, so I'm going to try to present my own personal perspective on this as much as possible without rehashing many of the common complaints most people have with it. Yeah, that's probably not going to happen, but let's see. Okay, this is a shorter review, fortunately, so it won't take me nearly as long. It shouldn't be as tedious, hopefully. Okay, the biggest problem this movie has is its badly written characters. Okay, this is not an original complaint at all, but whatever. You would think that Obi-Wan and Anakin's relationship would be the focus, but Obi-Wan has almost nothing to do here other than expository dialogue. This is pretty much taken from the Plinkett reviews, but whatever. The few character moments he does get are with Qui Gon and Anakin. In fact, I don't think they speak to each other even once in the entire film. Well, first of all, that's not true. They definitely have a conversation near the end of the film. It doesn't explore their relationship a whole lot. That's true. George Lucas wanted to explore Anakin as a child, and he wanted to, have Qui-Gon be really the true Jedi. In some ways, the Jedi that Obi-Wan and the other Jedi should be. He's the only one, really, who is prepared to properly train Anakin. So that's really what this story is about. I'm kind of saying, well, I think it should have been about this, but I mean, you have to judge movies on what's there, not what you want to be there. So, this is not a good way to approach a review. Okay, let's see what else I have to say about the characters. This becomes especially problematic in later installments, as their relationship is so crucial to the saga as a whole. Okay, so what I'm arguing here is that it was vital that this film sets up the relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin, because it's so important to the saga as a whole. But I mean, there's no reason why they can't just explore that in later movies, and they do. And really, you have to look at this holistically. You have to look at the prequel trilogy as a whole to determine whether or not that relationship is, well established. I never reviewed Attack of the Clones, which is obviously one of the films that explores that the most. I've already kind of talked about, in my last video, how Revenge of the Sith, I think, does a pretty good job exploring their relationship. But yeah, I mean, certainly the later films in the trilogy are burdened as a result of not exploring it here, but I don't think they're unduly burdened, and I think they do a fine job. So I'm kind of just going outside of the scope of this review. I'd have to go and look at the trilogy as a whole to determine that, and I just don't do that here. So I guess I'm assuming, as I do often in these reviews, that my audience would agree that their relationship in the trilogy as a whole is not thoroughly fleshed out, and I'm placing the fault on this film, which I don't think is fair. Okay. Anakin himself is pretty much reduced to a savior stereotype. Again, I tackled this in my last review. It's not just a stereotype. He's kind of a child prodigy capable of building his own protocol droid and pod racer. Okay, so some people do complain that Anakin is a bit of a Mary Sue in this first movie. You know, he's just a young kid. He is able to do all these amazing things. I mean, I don't know. He's a slave. That's kind of his job. A lot of kids are, extraordinarily gifted, and, especially since Anakin is gifted in the Force, as we know, with the midichlorians and all that, it's not really that big of a leap, I don't think, that he can do these things. The film does provide an explanation, again, because he's the chosen one, so I don't have a problem with this anymore. Let's continue. With that said, he does have a few genuine character moments. Oh, good, I'm giving the film credit here. In one scene, some of Anakin's friends, at least I think they're his friends, yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. I'm not sure why I have this in parentheses here. Okay. Taunt him about his rather low prospects for winning the pod race. This is basically your classic underdog scenario. It might work if it wasn't for the rather poor acting from the kids in this scene, though I do think it creates at least a little sympathy for Anakin and increases the investment in the pod race slightly. Okay, so I'm very sparing with my praise here. I think this works. This works well. It is an underdog scenario. You do feel for Anakin, and it works. The kid acting isn't great. Kid acting is rarely that great. There are a few exceptions, but kids don't usually make great actors. These are extras in this case, so I really don't think this is that big of a problem. And yeah, this does create sympathy for Anakin. The other important scene is where he leaves his mother. Again, this works okay, thanks in no small measure to John Williams' score and also to Brunhilde August's performance. But the film hasn't done enough to make me care about Anakin for it to move me very much. Okay, I don't agree. The film has gone out of its way to make Anakin a very kind, sympathetic character up to this point.
Your son was kind enough to offer a shelter.
Come on, I'll show you 3
And again, we see he's very underprivileged. He lives in this, kind of squalor. He doesn't have, freedom to do what he wants because he's a slave. He's not some super complex character, but it's a pretty sympathetic situation, and it works. I would not say the film hasn't done enough. It could have been better, I suppose. It could have explored it more deeply. But Anakin's, a pretty young kid at this point, and young kids don't have, super complex psychologies, generally speaking. So this is fine. Okay, then there's Qui Gon Jinn. Now, I like Liam Neeson as much as the next guy, but Qui Gon is not a very well-written character. His only noticeable trait is his occasional stretching of the rules. Okay, yeah, that's a noticeable trait. That's, the main thing with his character. His stretching of the rules, it's supposed to signal that, again, he's the only true Jedi.
If you would just follow the code, you would be on the council. They will not go along with you this time.
You still have much to learn, my young apprentice.
And it's not actually his only noticeable character trait. He's shown to be very sympathetic, especially to people who are often overlooked by others, namely Anakin and also, of course, Jar Jar. Obi-Wan dismisses them both as pathetic life forms, and Qui-Gon sees value in them.
To get us through the planet's core. This Gungan may be of help.
He insists on taking both of them along. He sees value where other people don't. That's a pretty distinctive character trait, I think. He's a naturally very compassionate person. Compassion is certainly a strong character trait in my book. Okay, what else do we have to say about Qui-Gon? He and Obi-Wan's relationship is reduced to him giving out generic sagely advice, and Obi-Wan occasionally making a dry joke like, the negotiations were short. So, first of all, Obi-Wan is always a good source of comic relief in these movies, especially somewhat more adult-friendly comic relief, compared to the more silly stuff with Jar Jar and Anakin in this movie. But anyway, that's beside the point. I think he and Obi-Wan's relationship is better than I'm giving credit for here. It's at least a little deeper. I wouldn't call the sagely advice generic necessarily. I mean, it's pretty specific to Star Wars stuff, like he talks about living in the moment and not always looking into the future, which is something that Yoda also hinted at in Empire Strikes Back. So this is very much building on what we heard there and being consistent with it.
All his life has he looked away to the future, to the horizon.
Also, I mean, it's very important that Obi-Wan, again, and this is subtle. There's a lot of subtle stuff in this movie, which is, I think, part of the reason why it's so underrated. But Obi-Wan at times resents Qui-Gon's unorthodox actions, in comparison to the other Jedi. But he also respects him, and there's a very good scene where he goes to Qui-Gon and says how much he appreciates him, telling the council that he's ready for the trials. And that whole thing, with him saying, I think Obi-Wan's ready for the trials, that's also important to their relationship. So I think there's more to their relationship than I'm giving credit for. It's not some huge focus in the movie, but, I think you understand it pretty well. All right. Finally, there's Padme. In some ways, she's actually the most developed character. She clearly feels a lot of responsibility for her people, but seems to lack the experience to really effectively lead them. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually, I think on this viewing, I was already starting to realize that this film was better than I'd given it credit for. This is the first time I had noticed how much the plot really revolves around Padme. Padme is really, in many ways, the protagonist. Or at least she's the one who moves the plot forward and who the plot revolves around. I don't think I quite recognized that here, but I do recognize that there is a lot more going on with her character than I had realized before. So I definitely think that this review, at least so far, has recognized some things about the prequels that I wouldn't have back in 2013 when I wrote my Revenge of the Sith review. So this is good about Padme so far. Let's see what else I have to say. She also goes through an arc of sorts, gaining a certain amount of humility through her experience on Tatooine. With that said, Natalie Portman's performance is really stiff and lifeless. Her range of emotions are basically stoic, vaguely cheery, and pouty. As a result of this, her character is not ultimately very likable. So I would disagree. I talked last time a little bit about Natalie Portman's acting. As I said, her line delivery isn't always the best. This is probably partly a result of the somewhat stilted dialogue, which again I talked about a little last time. But I think her emoting, as I said, and her facial expressions are always pretty much on point. Especially if and Rick Worley talks about this in his review. But if you turn it to a different language, or even just turn the audio off and just focus on the facial acting, the emoting of the actors, I think the performances, including Natalie Portman's, are all pretty solid. And regardless, I think her character is likable, and I think I was already starting to realize that here. I just hadn't quite gone far enough yet because I was very biased against these movies. Okay. As for her relationship with Anakin, it comes across as more creepy than anything, considering how much younger Jake Lloyd was than Portman, 8 years to be precise. Okay, so a lot of people complain about this. Again, I think this comes from a misunderstanding of their relationship. Padme is not sexually attracted to Anakin in this movie, and I don't think he is with her either. I don't think he's necessarily supposed to have reached puberty yet here. I could be wrong about that. Maybe I'm misreading it. But I think he sees her more as a mother figure, especially once he leaves his own mother. And that becomes an important thing in the series moving forward. I think there's a certain amount of what you might call the Oedipus complex, where his love for his mother ends up turning into this kind of weird dysfunctional relationship with Padme as the series goes on. And that's another important thing to note, is that his relationship with Padme is ultimately kind of dysfunctional and destructive. This is partly because he has to hide it from the Jedi, but it's also partly because of this sort of, I would argue, dysfunctional way it begins. And again, it doesn't start, I don't think, as a romantic relationship. It's more a kind of, matronly love. And again, I think Padme, her relationship with Anakin in this movie is more like an older sister or mother. It doesn't turn into romance until later on, when they meet each other again many years later. And again, it's because of this sort of strange way their relationship begins that the romance becomes dysfunctional and ultimately destructive. So I think people are just misreading that. I don't agree with people who say that Anakin should have been a teenager in this movie. Okay, so in my first paragraph, actually talking about the movie, as I said, I do think I'm giving this film more credit than I did with Revenge of the Sith, and I was already probably starting to come around on these movies, but I wasn't there yet. So let's move on to the second paragraph. The other big problem the Phantom Menace has is the way it's shot and edited. Here we go again. If I learned one thing from my most recent viewing, it's how sloppily edited this film is. As shown in the video below, the transitions between scenes are particularly bad. Many scenes end with the character saying a line of dialogue and the camera awkwardly holding on them for a second or two before a wipe to the next scene. So I have this video here. This is one of the most watched videos on my channel, which is sort of ironic, I guess, at this point. I created it specifically to use for this review. So in isolation, it kind of doesn't make sense, which I think I confused a lot of people based on the comment section for that video. But anyway, watching that video again and watching the film again, I really don't think there's a big problem with transitions. The awkward pauses I'm talking about, that's more about like the performances than the actual editing. So this is in many ways a display of my ignorance about film and film language at this time, the time I wrote this review. I've already talked a bit about the performances, and they can be a bit stilted at times, and that's mainly what I was noticing here. There are one, maybe two edits. I think it's just the one where it's a bit abrupt, where like a character says something and then it like cuts off like too soon. But for the most part, the editing in this movie is perfectly fine, and this is not legitimate criticism. Okay, in addition to this, many scenes, particularly those involving the Trade Federation, are really brief, giving the film a rather disjointed feel. Okay, so I'm basically just saying that these scenes are too short, I guess. Again, I don't really think, going back to the film, that this applies at all. It's very much in the same vein as the OT. We'd get these very brief little moments with the Empire, stuff with Tarkin aboard the Death Star, stuff with, the Emperor and Vader at Episode 6. They'd be very short, and then we'd do that, and then we'd transition to something else. When you have multiple things going on in the story, it makes sense to edit it this way. This is not a good complaint. Okay, another result of the sloppy filmmaking, is that most of the action scenes lack any tension. This is partly because I'm not invested in the characters of the story. More importantly, though, these scenes aren't set up well. Okay, let's see what I have to say here. Most of them occur rather at random. The first lightsaber battle happens when Darth Maul attacks Qui Gon as he's about to board the ship. I have no idea why he chose a specific moment instead of attacking him when he's more isolated in the middle of the desert, but it's probably because the writer, aka George Lucas, needed to give him and Anakin a quick and easy escape route. Okay, so I have to watch the film to be sure of this, but I'm pretty sure Maul doesn't know exactly where the Jedi are until this scene. He arrives on Tatooine and he's looking for them, and I'm pretty sure he just kind of comes upon them, because his spy droid finds the Queen's ship, so he's heading there, and they just happen to meet each other at this time. So there's not really anything random about his choice. I guess it's kind of a coincidence that he happens to find him just as they're leaving. So you could argue that that's contrived at least. But there's something that doesn't make sense here. It's just a little bit contrived. Okay, continuing, this is rather typical of the action scenes in this film. They come out of nowhere and quickly end with little or no real threat to the characters involved. I wouldn't really agree with this. There are a lot of very brief bits of action, and I would say especially toward the beginning of the film that it is a bit rushed. My most recent viewing, I would say, noticed that it was a bit rushed. And I think the first act is just a bit rough in general, mainly because there's a lot going on, a lot to set up, and it's going through things very fast, going from one location to another. And I think that's part of the reason why it took me so long to really get to like this film, because it doesn't really get going as much until the second act. Okay, so I mean that's not a completely illegitimate complaint, but it's mostly with the stuff at the beginning, which is basically there to set up how, BA and how efficient the Jedi are at, taking care of droids and stuff. Okay. Another issue is that half of the time the characters act really nonchalant during these scenes, like they don't really care. Again, so this is just, the Jedi are very powerful. This is just making that clear. Most of the scenes early in the film are just dealing with a few droids, so it's not really that much of a threat. The threat builds up as the film goes on, and I do give it some credit, because I say after this, the only two sequences where these problems aren't present are the pod race and the final battle, though even these scenes have some major problems. The climax in particular is way overstuffed, jumping back and forth between 4 different action scenes with very little connecting threads between them. Okay, so that was a really brief summation of what I thought at the time was wrong with that scene. I mean, this is a very, very common complaint, that there's too much going on in the climax. There's certainly a lot of different tones. There's, of course, that infamous scene in the making of documentary for Phantom Menace when George Lucas talks about this. But this is very intentional on his part. As the series goes on, in terms of release order, the climaxes keep getting more and more complicated up to Phantom Menace. The first one is very straightforward. The second one, you have kind of 2 different parallel action scenes which comes together. The third one, you have 3 different action scenes which all parallel each other. And here you have 4. So it kind of keeps building up in complexity up to this point, if you're watching them in release order at least. And Lucas was getting more and more ambitious. And this is, I think, certainly the most ambitious in terms of scale of the Star Wars film so far. And I mean, I guess it just depends on the person how well this works, but I don't think this is a problem. I think he juggles the different tones fairly well. There are problems with the climax, which I won't get into here because it has nothing to do with what I'm actually saying here. But I think just saying it's overstuffed is kind of simplistic, and I would have really needed to go into that in more detail to have established that. But yeah, that's really all I have to say about that for now. Okay, I could go on and on about the problems with this film. As many people have mentioned, the political machinations are confusing. No, they're not confusing at all, if you pay attention, whatever. And boring. Again, wrong. Though I think they could have worked if they were better explained and presented with better dialogue and more lively shooting and editing. So again, I guess I'm reiterating what I said before, that the shooting and editing aren't very good. Although I didn't talk specifically about the political scenes, so I haven't really, specifically established what's wrong with the shooting and editing in those scenes. I guess I'm just assuming that my audience has seen the Plinkett reviews and knows what I'm referring to. Of course, those reviews don't actually establish that very well either, but whatever. Okay, as for the plot being confusing, I really don't think so anymore. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, really. Palpatine is just goading the Trade Federation, into attacking Naboo, so he can have an excuse, to call for a vote of no confidence in Chancellor Valorum, and then, hopefully become the Chancellor himself. And he ends up, of course, being able to use the situation with Padme to do this. So that works out to his advantage, but in any case, I mean, his plan is pretty easy to understand. It is true, I think, and no one really talks about this, but if you're watching the films in chronological order, you don't actually know that Palpatine and Sidious are the same person. So it wouldn't really be clear for someone watching this film for the first time without having seen any of the others, why exactly Sidious is doing the things he's doing if you don't know that he's Palpatine. I think that's actually a legitimate complaint, but I don't make it here, so my original review still sucks. I won't even get into Jar Jar or midichlorians, so good. But suffice to say, one is incredibly irritating, and adds a lot of lowbrow, childish humor to the film, and the other reduces the mystical force to a measurable scientific quantity. Okay, so, I mean, plenty of other people have made this clear, but, Star Wars is always made for young children. There's no problem with having kiddish, childish humor in the films. If adults can't take that, if they can't watch a movie with their kids and, stomach some humor aimed at their children, that's really their problem. As far as the midichlorian thing, I think I've gotten into this a little bit before, but I really don't think that the midichlorians reduce the Force to a measurable scientific quantity. Mainly because the midichlorians aren't themselves the Force. They simply are something inside a person which helps to communicate with the Force. Now, yes, they do use the midichlorians and measure the amount in the bloodstream in this film to try to determine if Anakin's the chosen one, but this does not seem to me like it's definitive. They're not actually sure what it means.
What does that mean?
I'm not sure.
It just seems to be indicative that perhaps Anakin is stronger in the Force than most people. This doesn't mean that you can simply reduce it to a scientific thing. I suppose an argument can be had about this, but what I say in the review is too simplistic, like most of the things I say in this review. Okay. I also think that it's telling that both these elements were greatly reduced in the prequels. Well, yeah, because, stupid people complained about it, and George Lucas decided not to rock the boat too much. Okay. Here we go again. Is there anything I like in this movie? Not much. Ewan McGregor was a good casting choice, even if he has nothing to do. So yes, I agree he was a good casting choice. I do not agree that he has nothing to do. He was not as much of the focus as I might have liked, but this movie wasn't written by me. It was written by Lucas, and Lucas wanted to focus on the relationship between Qui Gon and Anakin. He wanted to focus on setting up the world, and establishing who Padme was, establishing Anakin's backstory. The relationship between Obi-Wan and Anakin will be explored more later on. And their lack of a relationship in this movie is an important element later on in that it'll eventually fall apart. So I don't agree that he has nothing to do, and I don't agree that it's a problem. Certainly, obviously he has to fight Darth Maul at the end to beat him. And this is, of course, important because it sets up how he becomes Anakin's master. We see his relationship with Qui-Gon explored a little bit here and there. He has some things to do. And again, it's enough to work and to set up for later films. Okay, Ian McDiarmid is appropriately menacing as Palpatine Darth Sidious. Yep, right on. The duel of the faces is really cool, if a bit disconnected from the rest of the climax. I don't think it's that disconnected. The Darth Maul is basically just concentrated at this point on getting, his revenge on the Jedi. So he goes and he faces them, and that way they can't help the Queen, which obviously would have been very helpful if they were there to help her take down Gunray. She's able to do it without them. And again, this kind of goes into the theme of the bad guys always underestimating the good guys, which goes throughout all the Star Wars movies. But I would not say it's disconnected. And of course, it's very, very important for establishing things in the saga as a whole. This is, again, basically Qui-Gon fighting for the future of the Jedi. Okay, once he's finally allowed to go all out, Ray Park is an energetic physical performance as Darth Maul. Yep, that's true. There are some cool sets, and the costume and makeup design is top-notch. Yep, all true. Ben Burtt's sound design is great as always. I do like the pod race, even if it is basically CGI Ben-Hur. That's not really fair. The pod race takes some things from Ben-Hur, but it takes things from many different movies. Most, movie scenes take things from other movies that inspired them, other stories that inspired them. This is just the way art works. So that's not really a fair criticism if it's meant to be a criticism. The CGI itself holds up better than I thought it would. Though the excessive use of green screen is really off-putting, I would still say that there is some use of green screen, overuse of green screen in this film. It doesn't always look great, but yes, most of the effects hold up really well. People who complain, that these movies don't have good effects, I don't really agree with them. It's not perfectly consistent, not all the effects are perfect, but it holds up pretty well for a movie from 1999. Okay, of course, John Williams' score is awesome. Yep, true. Unfortunately, none of this is enough to save the movie. So the Phantom Menace remains a clunky, tedious mess, albeit one with lots of eye candy and a killer soundtrack. Yeah, it's not... I think I've established in this video that it's not a clunky, tedious mess, so hopefully. Or at least that my arguments for that are terrible. So, yeah, I gave the movie a 4 out of 10, apparently. I would not give it that now. I'd probably give it at least an 8 out of 10. So I hope you guys have enjoyed these couple of videos. I've definitely come around a lot in the prequels. Anomaly Inc. has had a lot to do with that, as has Rick Worley. Other people online who've defended the prequels. And yeah, my movie philosophy, the way I look at movies, has just changed a lot over the past few years. I've matured a lot. It's just made me see these movies in a new light. And I think if people look at these movies and try to get rid of their preconceptions about what they think Star Wars should be, or things they've heard about from the print reviews and other places about why these movies are bad, I think they'd like them a lot more. Anyway, if you like my content, please like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon. Thank you.